Okay, can you hear me now? I just fiddled things around. Hopefully it'll start working. If it doesn't, I honestly have no idea what to do at this point. Okay, hold on again. Wait, I can hear it. It's working. Okay, can you hear me now? I just fiddled things around. Hopefully it'll start working. Let me mute this. Okay, we seem to be finally working. I apologize for the delay, ladies and gentlemen. Good evening. Welcome to tonight's episode of Paranormal Encyclopedia. I'm not super thrilled with the topic I'm doing tonight, but some of the recent revelations have left me with a moral feeling like I need to talk about it. So, one of my cardinal rules when I started doing this show over 5 years ago now was I don't want to badmouth religions, I don't want to badmouth other investigators. There is an exception to this, which is groups that do things that are illegal and or immoral, and I'm afraid that the Jehovah's Witness organization has been found guilty of doing some really horrible things that people need to be aware of. Let me be clear on something. I personally have doctrinal things I disagree with the Jehovah's Witnesses about in relationship to how they translate the Bible, their teachings about who Jesus was, the existence of a hell, and things of that nature. I'm not going to address those tonight. People, as far as I'm concerned, people are entitled to disagree with me on theology as much as they'd like. That's not where I'm going to take issue. There's three issues. Well, four. Let's see. There's a couple issues I want to talk about tonight. I'm going to talk about their prophecies, because I think that's the central thing to consider about any group that's going to claim that it speaks for God. Because let's be clear, the Jehovah's Witnesses, which most of you probably know as those Christians that like to come around and knock on your door and hand you paper, all sorts of pamphlets and things, and talk about the kingdom of God and things like that. But I think a good grounding to talk about problems with their beliefs is to talk about the fact they've made multiple predictions of the end of the world, which is also a really central problem that gets into one of the other topics I want to talk about, which is whether or not they qualify as a cult. And more specifically, when I say do they qualify as a cult, do they qualify as what would be more properly called the destructive cult? Because cults, in and of them, a cult is not in and of itself a negative connotation. Every religion in the world fit most definitions of a cult at some point in its history. Depending on the definition you use, most, if not all of them, still meet many of the definitions. But there are specific characteristics that you find in a cult that is dangerous, and I'm going to talk about those. I'm going to talk about whether or not I feel the Jehovah's Witnesses fit this. Then we're going to get into the two really serious problems I have with them. The reasons why I'm doing this episode. One is their practice of what they call shunning, and the other, the far more awful one, is their practices regarding what they call the two witnesses rule, particularly as it relates to the molestation of children. Let me be clear before I get into any of these topics. The majority, in my personal opinion, the majority of members of the Jehovah's Witness organization are kind people who honestly and sincerely believe what they're saying. And this is something I want people to remember when they come to your door, because I know how frustrating it can be. But understand this about Jehovah's Witnesses. A core teaching of the Jehovah's Witnesses that goes right into the first topic I want to talk to tonight is that the end of the world is not going to happen within moments. I mean, it could be tonight, it could be tomorrow, it could be any day now. But they expect it to happen extremely soon, like within my lifetime soon. They don't believe in hell, which is one of the big differences between them and mainstream Christianity. They believe in a tradition which is commonly called annihilationism. They believe that if you aren't a Jehovah's Witness, or you weren't one of the early apostles or the prophets of the Old Testament, or another person who was of the right branch of Judaism or Christianity, but if you don't fit into the small category, You will die and cease to exist, and that's it. At Armageddon, at the final battle that they believe is coming, they believe that most of the world population is going to die horribly and in pain. But after that, there's nothing more. There is no torture. Um, there is no final torment. But so the thing to understand is they sincerely believe that if you don't come around to their way of thinking, you're going to die soon and you're going to die horribly, and that's it. And they want to save you from that fate. I don't agree with them on many things, but I think it's worth respecting that for a lot of Jehovah's Witnesses, they're coming to your door out of a sense of love. And I'm not saying you have to sit there and hear them out. In fact, I'll get to a trick in a minute about what to do if you don't want to hear them out. I'm just saying, be polite. Don't curse at them. Don't slam doors in their faces. Don't set dogs on them. People really do those things. And it's horrible. These are decent, everyday human men and women who believe they have something vitally important to share with you that will literally save your life. Turn them away if you wish. And I'm going to get into what I think are some good reasons to do so. But do so in a kind, respectful manner, because they're human beings, and human beings deserve that basic level of respect. Okay? Now, here's what you can do if you have Jehovah's Witnesses that keep showing up at your door and you don't want them to do it anymore. It's not well known, but there are a number of really good former Jehovah's Witnesses channels on YouTube. There will be links in the description. Two of the excellent ones I know of, and there are more, are the John Cedars channel, done by a man by the name of Lloyd Evans, and the Telltale Atheist channel. Both of them are atheists, as the Telltale Atheist name would obviously indicate. But both of them have a lot of very good, very well-researched, well-documented information. And that's where I found out this particular trick from. But you have Jehovah's Witnesses come to your door. You don't want them to come back. You don't want to deal with them. Politely ask to be placed on the do not call list. Not every witness that comes to your door may know about this. You may need to ask them to talk to their circuit overseer. You may need to call. You might even potentially have to call the Kingdom Hall. But just ask to be put on the list, and they should leave you alone. They may come back in a year or two, because people move. Here in 2020, you might not want to listen to them. Maybe in 2021, you change your mind and you're more interested in what they have to say. But you're not going to hear from them for at least a year or two, maybe longer. You may have to remind them a couple of times, because, again, people are human. The information gets around. But by and large, they'll generally leave you alone. Obviously, some of them will not, and because people are people, and you may get into issues of harassment, in which case, again, I would recommend talking to the Kingdom Hall, trying to be polite, and eventually, if it becomes enough of a problem, you can eventually involve the police. But I try to avoid doing that, because, again, you're dealing with people who sincerely believe they're trying to help you, whether you agree with them or not. They do not deserve to be ridiculed. They do not deserve the harsh treatment. They certainly don't deserve how, in Russia right now, it's actually illegal to be a Jehovah's Witness. Let me be clear. I absolutely do not approve of the outlawing of anyone's religious belief, whether I agree, like it or not, whether I agree with it or not. Unless a group, punish religious people for committing crimes. Don't punish entire religious groups. Just like the Catholic Church. I wouldn't agree with outlawing the Catholic Church. I absolutely would agree with arresting priests who've been accused of child molestation and putting them on trial for their crimes. But there are many Catholics, just like there are many Jehovah's Witnesses, who are innocent, decent people who mean no harm, and they should be treated as such, whether you agree with them or not. So, I don't want to get too deep into what they believe, but I think there's a few things that's worth talking about at this point. One is particularly who founded them, which was a man by the name of Charles Taze Russell. He was a member of an older movement known as the Millerites. The Millerites are particularly famous because in the 1800s they were absolutely convinced the world was coming to an end. There was an event that happened. Give me one moment, because I should look this up earlier. I looked up everything else I wanted to mention, but I forgot this one. But there's an event known as the Great Disappointment. The Great Disappointment happened in 1844 when the leader of the Millerites Who and it's worth mentioning the Millerites eventually splintered off to become what's now known as the Seventh Day Adventists. But the man who led them was convinced the world was going to end in 1844. He convinced a lot of his followers that this was going to happen. And people quit their jobs, people sold their homes. They filled up stadiums waiting for the end. And when it didn't happen, because obviously we're all still here, this led to a number of responses. Some people gave up and just decided the whole thing wasn't true, that William Miller was mistaken. Some people thought his mathematics were off, because he did this whole thing with Daniel 8 and a bunch of other Bible verses to calculate when the end of the world was going to happen. And they thought, well, maybe one of his numbers is off, which is where Russell comes in. Russell becomes convinced that the world's going to end, that 1878 is the big date. That Jesus said, come back to earth in 74, and he was gathering his flock. And at the end of the gathering would be in 1878, which would be the end of the world. When that didn't happen, he reworked his numbers and came up with 1881. Obviously, nothing happened in 1881. So he revised his numbers again and came up with 1914, which is a particularly important date for Jehovah's Witnesses. 1914 is referred to as the end of human rulership. Russell taught, and Jehovah's Witnesses believe, that at this point Jesus Christ returned invisibly to the earth, chose of all the churches of the earth, the Jehovah's Witnesses, as the most faithful of his followers to be his one true church, and commissioned them to prepare the world for the end times. There's a lot of biblical reasons why this doesn't work. The Bible says that when Jesus comes back, every knee shall bow, every tongue shall confess, and he will split the eastern sky, none of which happened in 1914. Jehovah's Witnesses believe things happened visibly, and they will point to World War I breaking out in 1914 as evidence that they were right. There's a number of other predictions. They moved things to 1918. They claimed in 1925 the great patriarchs of the Bible would come back, which obviously again didn't happen. And then the big date, the one that's particularly significant in their predictions of the end of the world, is 1975, when they were absolutely convinced that the world was going to end. There was all of their literature at the time, leading up to 75, said the world was going to end. They had a big saying, witnesses at the time had a big saying, stay alive to 75. If you're on your deathbed, one more day, one more hour, one more week, one more year, just trying to make it to 75 to see the glorious appearing and the return of Jesus Christ and the end of the world. And obviously this didn't happen. The Watchtower has since, of course, claimed that it wasn't really a prophecy, that it was just a big popular idea that came about. But again, if you read the literature prior to 1975, they were very sure it was in fact a prophecy. All of this is important for one reason. Let me look it up again. Which is Matthew 24:36, which says, No one not knows the day nor the hour, not even the angels or the Son, but the Father alone. And it's talking about the end of the world and when Jesus comes back. Jesus said that no one could know the day of his return. So, right here, the Millerites in the 19th century, the Jehovah's Witnesses, through multiple different failed predictions, that guy you all probably remember, Harold Camping, who kept predicting it. He predicted the end of the world something like 7 times, with the last one being in 2011, I want to say. They're fundamentally making a biblical mistake, which is they're trying to predict what Jesus himself said was unpredictable. This in and of itself is not necessarily a problem, but here's why I bring this up and why I consider it concerning. A lot of the big doomsday cults. Um, Shinrinko, which was responsible for the sarin gas attack on Tokyo. Um, Heaven's Gate, who famously committed mass suicide because they believed that Jesus was coming back on a UFO trailing the Hale-Bopp comet. The Branch Davidians, Jonestown, are obsessed with end times prophecy. Um, and it's led to tragedy in the past. And Jehovah's Witnesses take their belief that the end is imminent very seriously. They hold drills for, when the Antichrist reveals himself and declares war on Christians. Where's the family going to go? What do they grab? If they get the call from the Kingdom Hall, who's doing what in the evacuation of the house? Where are they going in the middle of the night? The idea of hiding in bunkers, going underground. And this concerns me because in the past, this kind of thinking has led to mass suicide. I'm not saying Jehovah's Witnesses are there. I don't think they are. But there is a very us versus them mentality that in the past has been very dangerous. And it seems like it's getting worse. All of this leads, I think, very naturally into my next topic, which is, so are Jehovah's Witnesses a cult? There are there are a lot of different ways to define a cult, but there are three primary methods that I'm going to use tonight. All academic. Well, two academic and one that's used by law enforcement. So the first academic example is the cult's defined as a new religious movement that is significantly different from the mainstream religions around it. Jehovah's Witnesses, I think, qualify as a cult here. Their view of Jesus is very different than mainstream Christianity. They don't see him. They see him as the Son of God. They don't see him as part of God. They see him as having been the Archangel Michael in his time before he came to Earth. They, like I said, they're annihilationists. They don't believe that humans go to hell. There are other significant differences. Now, the thing to realize here is this definition of a cult is not a negative one. Any new religion qualifies as a cult under this definition. The problematic definitions of cult are the next two. The one that's used by law enforcement, which I think has a lot of merit, is a religious group that has committed crimes is defined by the law enforcement community as a cult. So, the Satanic Temple is not a cult under law enforcement definition because they don't actually commit crimes. Jehovah's Witnesses, unfortunately, are, and we're going to kind of come around back to that when I get to my last point for the evening. The third definition was put forward by a sociologist by the name of Stephen Hassan, and it's known as the bite model. I am by no means an expert on the bite model, nor am I an expert on Jehovah's Witnesses, so I'm going to go over it very briefly, and then highly recommend that people go check out Telltale Atheist video comparing the bite model to the Jehovah's Witnesses. As an ex-Jehovah's Witness, he knows far more about them than I do, and he's dedicated his life to studying. Okay, apparently I got disconnected momentarily, so I'm by no means an expert either on the bite model or Jehovah's Witnesses. I would highly recommend people watch the video that was made by Telltale Atheist about the bite model in relationship to Jehovah's Witnesses. He does a far better job than I can, but I'm going to go over it briefly and give my own thoughts, which are largely going to be his because I agree with him. So, under the four categories, Hassan divided it down into specific things. Does the group promote dependence and obedience? To some extent, I think, particularly, there's a very us versus them mentality common with witnesses that every other religion, even other Christian religions, are secretly under the control of Satan. That the only truth is through the witnesses. Modifying behavior with rewards and punishments is the next one, and they're very guilty of this. They have a system called of what they call shunning, and basically, if you do anything that displeases them, they will kick you out. Your friends and family won't talk to you anymore. You'll be a pariah, a non-person, until your behavior comes back in line with what the group wants. Dictate where and with whom you live. They don't do this as much. They do to a point in that um, often when they close a kingdom hall, they're what they call their churches. They'll shift people to other kingdom halls. They don't let you decide where you go. You go where they tell you to. They may split the family up and send other people to other places. Um, you don't necessarily have to move. So it's not really this, but there is a degree of okay, you have to go somewhere else. You may have to go to church away from your family. Um, they redirect or control sexuality. This is certainly an example. Um, Homosexuality is strictly forbidden. Sex before marriage is strictly forbidden. Engaging in either activity will get you shunned. Control clothing and hairstyle. They certainly have rules about this, particularly going to meetings when they go out in service, which is what they call when they come around and knock on your door. But it's not as severe as a lot of groups. Regulate how much you can drink. They have rules about what I believe they have rules about what you can drink. But again, they're not as severe as plenty of other groups. Deprive you of 7 to 9 hours of sleep. Not directly, but they do require everyone to do a certain amount of service, going around and knocking on doors every week, which can certainly interfere with your ability to get enough sleep. Exploit you financially. They're very guilty of this, particularly lately. Um, there's a series of cartoons that have been made called Caleb and Sophia, in which they even are telling small children, break open your piggy banks to donate to the Watchtower Society. Um, Jehovah wants you to give up your money for ice cream to the society, and how good and how noble and how wonderful it is to do this. And certainly it is a wonderful thing to donate money, and I think there's something very praiseworthy when a child chooses of their own free will to give money to a worthy cause. But the guilt tripping, in particular, I see as an issue. Restrict leisure time and activities. They have certainly things you can and can't do, and a whole big focus on staying away from the world and staying away from Satan's influences. But again, there are groups that are much worse about it. The last one under behavior control is require you to seek permission for major decisions, which, as I understand it, isn't a major issue with them. So under information control, you have deliberately withhold and distort information. Yes, absolutely. Particularly when we get into the molestation issues that I'm going to talk about at the end of this video. The church is very restrictive about what people can talk about. Sorry, my internet keeps cutting out for some reason. But yeah, very much so. You're not supposed to look at YouTube. You're not supposed to look at non-Jehovah's Witnesses websites. They even discourage people from going and getting higher education. You're encouraged to learn something practical, a trade, that type of thing. Generate and use propaganda. Divide information into insider versus outsider doctrine. Yes, there are things that they don't talk widely about with people that aren't members of the organization. Again, there are groups that are worse about this, I think, but there is that distinction. Generate and use propaganda extensively. It's hard to think of a group that a religious group in the world does this more than the Witnesses. They publish magazines, they publish books. I mean, the whole Watchtower Society started as a publication company. That's a pretty big deal. They are very big on the propaganda. Use information gained in confession sessions against you. There's truth to this as well. If you go to if you do something you consider wrong or know that the group considers wrong, and tell the elders about it, they're going to use it against you. They're going to shame you. They're going to shun you. Gaslighting you to make you doubt your own memory. I believe this happens as well, particularly again with the last topic of the evening. Require you to report thoughts, feelings, and activities to superiors. Again, this is true. Encourage you to spy and report on others' misconduct. I think this is also pretty common. Very much there's a mentality of, if you see somebody doing, having premarital sex or something like that, you need to tell it to the elders so that the elders can take action. Um, so moving on, you have thought control. And still black versus white, us versus them, good versus evil thinking. Again, this is another one they're big on. Everyone who isn't part of the organization is evil, is under the control of evil. Every religion, every branch of Christianity other than theirs is under the control of Satan. They are the only, they are the only truth. Change your identity, possibly even your name. This is another one they're not real big on. Use loaded languages and cliches to stop complex thought. I believe that's pretty common as well. Induce hypnotic or trance states to indoctrinate. You do see this with prayer and song. There are groups certainly that are bigger on it, but it does happen. Teach thought-stopping techniques to prevent critical thoughts. This is common to a lot of religions and certainly common here. If you start questioning, pray, read your Bible, that kind of thing. Only allow only positive thoughts is another common one, with this idea of you have to, your thoughts matter, and this idea that lusting after a woman after in your heart is already committing a sin with her. Use of excessive meditation, singing, prayer, and chanting to block thoughts. I believe there's some of that as well. And then reject analysis, critical thinking, and doubt. This is a big one with them. You don't question the governing body. You don't question the elders. You don't question what you're told. If you start doing that, they're going to kick you out. They're going to shun you. And again, I'm going to run through emotional control, and then I'm going to start talking about shunning. So the last group of categories: emotional control. They instill irrational fears, phobias of questioning or leaving the group. If you question them, if you stop being a Jehovah's Witness, you are going to die horribly in Armageddon. I mean, and Armageddon's around the corner. That's pretty grim. Label some emotions as evil, worldly, sinful, or wrong. Yes, again. Again, this is a good example of interrelation, because a lot of sects of Christianity do the same thing. And it's worth saying that lots of religions do at least some of these things to some extent. The more of them you do together, and the more severe you're about them, you start running into a problem. Teach emotion and stopping techniques to prevent anger and homesickness. I believe there's some of that, and things I've already got into. Promote feelings of shame, guilt, and unworthiness. Yes, very much. Shower you with praise and attention, what's commonly known as love bombing. Certainly when you first join a Kingdom Hall, you'll get a lot of this. You get welcomed, you get treated very well, you get treated very kindly. Everybody's very interested in you. You're encouraged to come back and things of that nature. There are cults that are much worse about this than Jehovah's Witnesses, and again, this isn't inherently necessarily a bad thing, but it can be used as a manipulation technique, and they do threaten friends and family. They don't really do that other than shunning or, of course, saying they're going to die horribly. Shun you if you disobey or disbelieve very much. That's our next topic. Teach that there is no happiness or peace outside of the group. This is another real big one with them. Only Jehovah's Witnesses are truly happy. Only Jehovah's Witnesses truly serve God. They have this very mentality that you have to be part of the group or you're not really happy. So I think, in my opinion, in Telltale, who, like I said, is far better informed about this than I am's opinion, and a lot of other people who studied them's opinion, yes, Jehovah's Witnesses qualify as a cult. Now let's get into the really serious problems and why I bring this topic up and break my rule about not bad-mouthing other people's religious beliefs. The first of the two main reasons is what's known as shunning. If you engage in behaviors that Jehovah's Witnesses consider wicked, and it gets back to the leaders, the elders, you will be shunned. Let's clarify both what I mean by these sinful behaviors and what shunning is and why this is immoral. So, questioning the governing body, questioning leaders, questioning the elders, questioning the doctrine, talking to other people that have been disfellowshipped or shunned, that have left the religion, watching videos like this one, sad to say, engaging in premarital sex, engaging in homosexual sex, all are things that will get you kicked out. They'll get you what's called shunned. When you are shunned, members of the religion are not allowed to talk with you. They're not allowed to interact with you. Your parent, I mean, let's be fair, witnesses do make some allowances for particularly close family members and obviously if the person's a minor. But the reality is, even though they say that now it's acceptable in these instances, the reality is, if your mother and father are Jehovah's Witnesses and you're shunned, especially if you're legal age, they're not going to talk to you anymore. They won't take a call from you if you're dying, from what I've heard from former members. Your friends, your relatives, everyone you know that's a member of the organization is going to cut you out of their life entirely. I find this incredibly immoral for a number of reasons, and it's certainly unchristian. In Christian terms, I'm reminded of the story of the prodigal son. When he went out, he left his father, he went out into the world, he did all sorts of sinful things. And when he came back, his father didn't tell him to go away or to go spend enough time at church, and then he'd allow him back in the house. He threw the door open and welcomed him back without question, without asking. Christians are called to love thy neighbor as thyself. Not to love other Christians as you love yourself. To love everyone as you love yourself. To love them as we love God. It is not Christian to show this kind of cruelty to people. And the reality is, it's the real reason it's being done, that this has been instituted, despite the fact that once upon a time they condemned the practice. Because there are older articles in Awake and there are other publications condemning the Roman Catholic practice of excommunication. And then they changed their mind, which happens a lot. Which reminds me of the other thing I need to talk about before I get to the sexual molestation. Because it's another example of this hypocrisy. But it's a manipulation tactic. They're trying to get those people that leave the religion, that question the religion, that do behaviors they find unacceptable, to come back. Not by treating them with love and kindness, not by accepting them, not by acting like Jesus did, by cutting off all of their emotional support so that their only choice is to rejoin the Jehovah's Witnesses, to come back under the control of the governing body. This is not how decent people treat each other. I mean, if we were talking about someone who had committed a violent crime, if we're talking about, and let me be clear about this, if we were talking about someone who raped you, I'd be all for saying, no, never talk to that person again. Somebody commits murders somebody you love, never talk to that person again. But somebody had sex before marriage, you're not going to talk to them until they grovel and repent? That's horrible. That's immoral. That's not going to convince them to change their behavior. It's going to convince them that you don't really care about them. It's going to drive them to depression and suicide. It is not how people should act. I mean, I can understand. They have more kindness for people who commit crimes often enough. And believe me, we're getting there. Than they do for people who just don't agree with what they believe anymore. And this destroys families, and this destroys people's lives. All in the name of greater control. I wish I could say that this is the worst thing about Jehovah's Witnesses. But there's two other things. One is horribly bad, and the other one I think is even worse, which is saying something. The next thing I want to talk about, the one I forgot, is they have an absolute steadfast refusal to accept blood. The Bible says that the blood is the life, and we are forbidden from eating blood. It comes up in Romans, it comes up in Genesis, I believe it comes up in Leviticus. It comes up several times that humans are not to consume the blood of any living thing. Okay. This is a big part of kosher law in Judaism. You know, the blood, when an animal is killed for consumption by Jews that follow kosher, the blood has to be drained out of it before the meat's eaten. It's a very big deal. I have no problem whatsoever with that. The problem is Jehovah's Witnesses, and to the best of my knowledge, only Jehovah's Witnesses, take that a step farther and say, no blood in your body, no taking foreign blood, period. This means if a child is dying, and the only way to let that child live is a blood transfusion, let the child die. When you're a Jehovah's Witness, you're to carry a card in your wallet that says that you will not accept blood transfusions. When a Jehovah's Witness goes to the hospital, the Kingdom Hall will send a special team of elders to the hospital to reinforce and to inform the doctors, no, they are not allowed to take blood transfusions. This kills people. This kills children. I've heard other people say it, and I agree. This is human sacrifice. This is killing a human being for the sake of your religious beliefs, and that is immoral. It's also bluntly, it is, or at least should be illegal, particularly in the case of when parents are refusing a blood transfusion to a child. Thank God, no pun intended, courts have intervened more than once and said, no, you can't refuse the medical treatment. But for God's sakes, if your child is dying, you should not need a court order to tell you to save the child's life. How sick a world do we live in that we would have that? It's incomprehensible to me. And it's not biblical. Nowhere in the Bible does it say anything about blood use for medical purposes. Not once. The restriction is very specifically, up to and including the original Hebrew, against eating blood, consuming blood. They have invented their own interpretation that even, to the best of my knowledge, even Hasidic Jews, the most strict followers of the laws of the Old Testament that you'll find, don't take it that far. Particularly because there's a concept you run into in Judaism, and you find it in Christianity as well, called Parish Negev, which to me is a wonderful concept that Christians should remember because Jesus practiced on this teaching. Under Parish Negev, you can ignore the laws of the Bible, with 3 exceptions, which is you cannot worship other gods, you cannot practice sexual immorality, and I forget what the other one is. But with those, the exception of those 3 things, you can violate the laws of the Bible to save a human life. In Judaism, the high law is to protect life. Do not allow people to die because you're following the law. Case in point, the Bible says you're not allowed to eat pork. If you're about to starve to death, you're allowed to eat pork. You're to put your own survival over that law. And not only is this a Jewish concept, Jesus used this Pikuach Nefesh, Pikuach Nefesh. They draw from Leviticus 18:5, which states, "You shall therefore keep my statutes and my rules. If a person does them, he shall live by them. I am the Lord." And Ezekiel 20:11, "And I gave them my statutes and showed them my judgments, which if a man do, he shall live in them." Jews read that to mean that you are to live for the law, not to die for the law. And what's beautiful about this concept, in my opinion, is how flexible it is. Oh, that's the three. You cannot defame God's names. You can't worship other gods. You can't bow to other gods. Things of that nature. Forbidden sexual relations, incest, homosexual sex, among men specifically. Having sex with another man's wife. Having sex with animals. And then the last one is you can't commit murder to save your own life. But what's beautiful about this concept, in my opinion, is the flexibility of it. In Jewish law, doctors are permitted. Normally, under a strict reading in the Old Testament, you can't work on the Sabbath. In Judaism, doctors are explicitly exempt from that requirement. Not only to save a human life, but if the person's in extreme pain, they can still act to relieve pain. They're allowed to do things like that, even on days that they're not supposed to work. They're allowed to eat when they're supposed to be fasting. They're allowed to break the rules because they are to live by the law, not to die by it. This is reinforced in the Talmud. This is a principle that Jesus himself seems to have followed more than once. For example, he was criticized by the Pharisees for healing people on the Sabbath. Healing people is work. By the technical definitions of the law, he broke the law. But he was going by the higher law of saving human life. Another example is gathering food on the Sabbath, which again is a violation of the law. But people need to eat. This obscene idea that you should let a child die, or even an adult die, rather than taking blood, violates so much of what the Bible teaches, violates how Jesus lived his life. And again, the Bible doesn't say anything about using blood for medical reasons. Nowhere, not once. It is not a biblical concept. This is just ridiculous. It is human sacrifice. You are killing someone for the sake of your religious beliefs, and it should stop. Now we're going to get into what I think is actually arguably even more horrible than this. Because of how widespread it is, and the fact that we're only just finding out about it, and how horrific an act it is. For the sensitive in the audience, I apologize, but what needs to be said needs to be said. It's well known, for good reason, that there has been a massive scandal within the Roman Catholic Church of Catholic priests molesting boys. What people don't talk, and people don't misunderstand the rest of what I'm about to say. People absolutely should be talking about that. That should be as an important a topic as it is. I do not mean to diminish how monstrous and disgusting and immoral it is for that kind of violation of trust. What I do mean to say, on the other hand, is people need to be aware that it's happening within the Jehovah's Witnesses as well. How widespread is it? We don't know. What we do know is this. In 2019, the Australian Royal Commission took the governing body and the Jehovah's Witnesses to task and has fined them millions of dollars to give up the names of known child molesters within the organization. In U.S. court, the governing body and its lawyers have actively fought for the right to maintain a database of child molesters and to keep it secret from law enforcement. If you talk to Jehovah's Witnesses, and I have, they'll tell you, oh no, they didn't know how widespread it was. They didn't know they were supposed to report. And that they don't keep the secret database. They do. We know it because the governing body admitted it in court. They have fought for the right to keep those records away from the police. And they base this on an absolutely idiotic concept, which is what they call the two witnesses rule. Based on the Bible, I will give them credit. For a crime to be punished, there has to be at least two witnesses to the event. If there is only one, outside of a direct confession, if there's only one witness, someone traditionally in the Bible can't be held guilty of a crime. The horrible problem with child molestation is it's not a spectator sport. And they don't usually confess. So all you have is the word of a child, of an abused, terrified child. And the governing body has decided that's not good enough. And they conduct their own investigation, go, oh well, we can't find two witnesses. Tell the family not to go to the cops. Quiet the whole thing up. Move the offending party to another congregation where it happens again. This is not acceptable. This makes me so angry I'm at a loss for words. The reality, I get the reason why let me be clear. I get the reason why the Bible had a two-witness rule to begin with. And in context, it makes sense. Because in ancient times, forensics wasn't a thing. You didn't, especially under Old Testament law, which can be very harsh, the eye for the eye, tooth for the tooth laws. If you're going to execute somebody, if you're going to beat somebody, if you're going to cut off body parts of someone, you want to be sure they did it. But it's the 21st century, for God's sakes. Forensics is a thing. Investigation techniques have come along immensely since ancient times. And what's really disturbing about it is when it comes to other crimes, they're willing to let forensics be the second witness. Heck, for some sins that aren't crimes, they don't even require two witnesses. If you get reported to the body of elders for having sex before marriage, you may very well be shunned on one person's word, even if you don't confess to it. But if you are accused of molesting a child, if they don't find two witnesses, they're going to shut the whole thing up, tell the parents not to report it, and move on. This cannot be allowed to happen. I do not think, let me be clear. The Soviet Union, not the Soviet Union, it's not the Soviet Union anymore. Russia has outlawed the Jehovah's Witness religion. I do not approve of that. I am absolutely opposed to outlawing any religious group, whatever I think of it. What I do think is that the lawsuits that are going on, the court cases, what's happened in Australia, what's now happening in the United States, need to continue. And they need to be held accountable for their crimes. And covering up child abuse makes you a party to it. I will say it again. I think the vast majority of Jehovah's Witnesses are decent people. I don't think most of them realize what's actually going on. They're actively being lied to by the leaders of their religion, which are a group of, to be blunt, doddering old men in New York who care more about personal power than protecting the interests of their followers. And this needs to stop. They need to be taken to task. The leaders need to be punished. The organization needs to face lawsuits. And this all goes for the Catholic Church as well. And any other organization, and the International Federation of Baptists, and any group that would molest children deserves punishment to the fullest extent of the law. I have no sympathy for that. And if you're not actively molesting it, but you're covering it up, I got no sympathy for you either. I think, we have a moral, if you think a child's being molested, you have a moral duty to report it to the cops. Teachers have that duty. Police officers, healthcare professionals all have that duty. Clergy and religious leaders should have that duty too. And if it isn't a duty under the law, you sure as heck have a duty under God to report those kinds of crimes, whether you believe them to be true or not. It is not the place of the governing body of the Jehovah's Witnesses. It is not the place of the various investigating tribunals within the Catholic Church. It is not the place of any non-law enforcement agency to decide what is and is not a criminal offense and what it should and should not be reported to the police. At least there are probably exceptions to that, but at least as far as crimes committed against innocent children. And there are other problems going on. There's child abuse and spousal abuse and things like that. People that can't leave because of the fact they'll be shunned, they'll be cut off from all of their support structures. This isn't acceptable and things need to change. And this is why this episode exists. This is why I feel the need to break my rule about not speaking ill of other people's religious beliefs. If Jehovah's Witnesses want to believe differently than I do, as far as I'm concerned, they are welcome to do so. I disagree with their doctrine in general, but I support their right to believe differently than I do, except where it harms others. They do not have the right to protect child molesters. They do not have the right to force families to split themselves apart. And they do not have the right to deny blood to children. Again, I want to recommend, we're going to be wrapping it up. I got a few more things to talk about, not related to my topic. Then I'm going to go, do something pleasant because it breaks my heart to talk about this kind of thing. It needs to be talked about, but it's just horrible. I highly recommend people that are interested in this topic check out Lloyd Evans on John Cedars channel. Check out Telltale Atheist on his channel. They have more information about it than I do. They are former members of the Jehovah's Witness religion, so they have an insider's perspective that I can't have because I was raised in the Roman Catholic Church. I wasn't raised as a Jehovah's Witness. I have never joined the Jehovah's Witnesses, and I never will, for the reasons I've outlined tonight. If anyone listening to this is a Jehovah's Witness and looking to leave, I wish you the very best of luck. It's not an easy road to go. I would recommend going to the resources as I've suggested, looking into Reddit groups for ex-witnesses, looking for the information that's out there. And I would particularly recommend before doing it, building as much of a support structure for yourself as you can. Because the reality is if you leave the witnesses, you're going to be cut off from everyone you know. At least everyone you know who's a member. And that's all the only way to live. You need people around you that care about you. I want to thank everybody who takes the time to listen to this. It's a lot more serious than many of my other episodes, but like I said, it's something that needs to be said. I am back, by the way. I apologize that I haven't done a video in like over a month now, I want to say. So, a belated Happy New Year to Merry Christmas to all of my viewers and friends. I'm going to try to start churning out videos again. There's been a big problem lately that my day job keeps me really busy and my schedule can change on a moment's notice. Um, but I think it's starting to stabilize again, and I should be able to start getting episodes out at least once a week. I'm going to try to do more, but no promises. My current goal right now is to get back to a once a week schedule, probably on the weekends if I can do it, and then we'll go from there. If you like what I'm doing, if you want to support the show, please like, comment, subscribe. If you don't like what I'm doing and you think I'm a bloody idiot, feel free to give me a thumbs down and tell me so in the comments. Just give me some. Let me know what you think. Honestly, um, I don't generally screen comments unless they fall into a couple of categories. Usually, extremely abusive comments, or when they get into certain topics that I recently, for example, I deleted a comment because they were getting into supporting the nonsense of satanic ritual abuse, and I won't tolerate that on this channel. It's destroyed too many innocent lives. But by and large, I try not to edit comments. I will comment back. I will usually snark at you. I had an amusing exchange a while back with someone who was telling me I was fake for the Houdini episode, and I still want to know, how am I fake for saying that nothing happened? It's like, nothing paranormal happened. That's fake. So you're saying something paranormal actually happened. You know? But again, that's going to do it for tonight, folks. If you have, aside from the other, on a more upbeat note, I should mention that my longtime friend and fellow YouTuber, Lupus Creepus, is still in fact back. He is doing videos about once a month now, so I highly recommend checking him out. Again, actually, I'm not even going to promote the Patreon this time because of the seriousness of the topic. But try to reach out. Instead, I'm going to ask, if you really want to support the show and more than like, commenting, and subscribing, reach out to somebody who needs you. Give people, love each other, give each other, support. We all need it. But that's going to do it for tonight. This has been your host, Kevin Mears, demonologist and the Paranormal Encyclopedia, saying good night and God bless.